They called me dramatic when I cut them off, but they forgot I recorded everything. Now they're desperate to reconnect, and I'm posting the truth. Maybe this time, they'll listen. They always said I was dramatic, a word they wielded like a blade, slashing away at my dignity whenever I dared to point out the cracks in the glossy facade they paraded for the world. I learned early how their whispers could turn into roars behind closed doors, how their smiles melted into sneers the moment company left. Every time I brought up the inconsistencies, the cruel jabs slipped like venom into casual conversations, or the endless expectations tethered to invisible strings. They would look at each other with raised eyebrows and smug smiles as if to say, "There they go again." It wasn't anger that filled me then, but a cold, gnawing confusion, a festering doubt that made me question the very ground under my feet. How many nights had I lain awake, sifting through every word, every sigh, every side-eye thrown across the dinner table, wondering if I had imagined it all. The betrayal was never grandiose. It was quiet, methodical, a slow poisoning that took years to corrode my sense of reality. Birthdays forgotten, achievements minimized, pain trivialized, all wrapped in the thin, suffocating film of, "We only want what's best for you." I was too sensitive when I cried, too combative when I questioned, too cold when I stopped playing along. They would sit in the living room under the soft halo of warm lighting, speaking in low, judgmental tones that sounded sweet to the untrained ear, but cut into me with 1,000 unseen knives. Outsiders saw perfection, a close-knit family who laughed at the same old jokes and hugged during every milestone, but I knew the truth. I lived it. And I bore the bruises, invisible but pulsing, just beneath the skin. At first I thought recording them was a betrayal, a breach of the loyalty I was so desperate to uphold. The guilt gnawed at me as I pressed the record button on my phone and slipped it into my jacket pocket before family dinners. The first time, my hands trembled so violently I thought the device would fall out. But the moment my mother spat out one of her signature backhanded compliments, her voice dripping with condescension, and my father barked his disapproval at my latest bad attitude, the guilt evaporated, replaced by a grim, cold satisfaction. I had proof now, tangible, irrefutable evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. Every insult, every manipulative deflection, every gaslight-drenched lecture was preserved in crystal clarity. Still, I didn't confront them. Not yet. I thought maybe I could reason with them, show them the error of their ways, convince them to see me, really see me, without the distortion of their biases. I played parts in their little charades, laughing when I wanted to scream, smiling when my soul felt like it was bleeding out through my teeth. I played the good child, the dutiful pawn, all while building a library of truth they thought was buried forever under layers of denial. The day I cut them off was not marked by fireworks or shrieking confrontations. It was quiet, surgical, a slow pulling away like a tide retreating from the shore, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and broken shells. I packed my things, left the keys on the worn oak kitchen table, and disappeared into the city where anonymity became my armor. At first there was silence, blessed, deafening silence. But the vacuum I left behind did not stay empty for long. Soon came the messages, thinly veiled accusations wrapped in faux concern, desperate calls pretending to seek reconciliation, but laced with guilt trips so familiar I could recite them like scripture. When I refused to return, they turned outward, crafting a new narrative where I was the villain, a spoiled ingrate who abandoned her loving family for no reason. They whispered to the neighbors, the church congregation, the extended relatives who hadn't seen me in years but were suddenly experts on my supposed decline. I saw the looks when I ventured home for a forgotten box of belongings, the tight smiles, the pitying glances, the whispered gossip that chased me like a bad smell. It should have broken me. It should have sent me crawling back, desperate for their approval, willing to swallow the lies just to be welcomed again. But it didn't. Not this time. Because now I had something they didn't anticipate. I had receipts. I spent months organizing them, cataloging every recording, every screenshot, every cruel text and contradictory message they had ever sent. I built a fortress out of the very stones they had hurled at me. And now, standing at the precipice of revelation, I felt an eerie calm wash over me. They were desperate now, sending cloying messages about family reunions, birthdays, holidays, playing the part of the sorrowful parents yearning for their wayward daughter. They begged to move forward, to let the past go. to start fresh. They thought if they painted the picture bright enough, loud enough, no one would look too closely at the brush strokes beneath. But they underestimated me. They mistook my silence for weakness, my retreat for surrender. What they failed to understand was that I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. The day I decided to post the truth, I didn't do it in anger. I wasn't seeking vengeance or validation. I was simply done carrying their shame like a yoke around my neck. I uploaded the first recording, a casual Sunday brunch where my mother mocked my career choices in front of guests, dressing it up as just a joke while my father nodded approvingly. I followed it with a text thread where they berated me for not attending a family wedding because I had been hospitalized with pneumonia. Layer by layer, I peeled back the mask they wore so proudly. The reactions were immediate. Messages flooded my inbox, some expressing disbelief, others horror, a few bitter attempts to gaslight me yet again, insisting I was taking things out of context. But I had built my case too meticulously for them to wriggle free. Every post was dated, every clip was contextualized, every lie neatly countered with brutal, undeniable reality. Their house of cards collapsed in slow motion, a beautiful, catastrophic implosion I watched with detached fascination. And yet, beneath the triumph, quiet sadness lingered. Not because I missed them, those illusions had long been incinerated, but because I finally understood that they would never change. The people I wanted to love me simply didn't exist beyond the roles they played for public consumption. They had never seen me, not really. They loved the idea of me, the version they could control, manipulate, parade like a trophy when convenient, and discard when inconvenient. Now, the world could see too. No more whispered half-truths, no more carefully curated narratives designed to keep me isolated and doubting. The truth stood naked, raw, and irrevocable. And maybe, just maybe, this time they would listen. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they would dig deeper into denial, crafting new lies to explain away the undeniable. It didn't matter. I hadn't done this for them. I did it for the version of myself who sat crying on the bathroom floor at 15, believing she was broken because her family told her so. I did it for every silent scream swallowed in the name of keeping the peace. I did it for the quiet, resilient voice inside me that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many times they tried. As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in molten gold and bruised purple, I leaned back in my chair and watched the notifications roll in. Each like, each comment, each private message was a crack in the facade they had spent years constructing. I wasn't the villain in this story. I never had been. And now the world knew it, too. The days that followed unfolded not in a furious storm but a slow, smoldering burn, like a fire feeding on a dense forest, consuming every brittle branch of lies, one by one. I did not refresh my phone obsessively, did not sit trembling in anticipation of the next ping or buzz. I let the chaos spin itself into being while I returned to my routines with a kind of detached serenity I had never known before. It was not victory I tasted, but liberation, the cool, sharp air after centuries of breathing smoke. Yet even liberation carries a strange weight. In the quiet moments, early mornings when the sun peeled itself lazily across my windows, or late nights when the city hummed in distant, indifferent pulses, I found myself sifting through emotions too tangled to name. Satisfaction danced uneasily with sorrow. Pride jostled against grief. There was no singular feeling, no neat resolution waiting like a reward for surviving the storm. There was only this strange, yawning space where the architecture of my old life had been. Their reactions came, as I expected, in waves. First, there was denial, so furious and desperate it was almost laughable. My mother, ever the actress, sent out messages to every corner of our extended social sphere, claiming the recordings were doctored, insisting the texts were fake, spinning frantic tales of a mentally unstable daughter with a vendetta against her innocent, blameless family. She used words like fabricated, slanderous, ungrateful. She spoke with the authority of someone who had never once considered the possibility that her mask could slip, that her performance could be dissected under the cold, unforgiving light of evidence. My father was quieter, as he often was when manipulation required more finesse than brute force. He did not flood my inbox with histrionics or public declarations. Instead, he operated through back channels, calling old friends, reaching out to employers of people I barely remembered. trying to poison the ground beneath my feet without ever stepping into the arena himself. It was cowardice masquerading as strategy, and for a time it worked in small pockets. Some people, invested in the mythology of my family's perfection, clung desperately to their denial like a raft in stormy waters. They wanted to believe I was the problem. It was easier than dismantling the fantasy they had so eagerly consumed, but the recordings, the screenshots, the paper trail of years could not be erased by a few panicked phone calls or crocodile tears. The narrative they had built, brick by brick, crumbled under the weight of their own words, their own deeds, captured in merciless clarity. Some who had once called me over-emotional, dramatic, selfish, some who had turned away from me in disgust when the first lies were whispered, now sent cautious, almost embarrassed messages. Apologies couched in soft, cowardly language. I did not respond. Their regret was too little, too late, and entirely self-serving. They mourned the loss of their illusions, not the harm they had helped perpetuate. Worse than the deniers, though, were the ones who tried to rewrite the story in real time. They reached out with saccharine pity, positioning themselves as neutral parties, as peacemakers. They spoke of healing and forgiveness as though the wound had not been deliberately inflicted, as though it had simply appeared one day without cause. They wanted to brush the rubble under a convenient rug, to pretend that now that the truth was inconveniently public, we could all just hold hands and smile for the camera once more. I felt nothing but a cold, exhausted rage for these people. Their words dripped with a cruelty more insidious than open malice. It was a cruelty of erasure, a demand that I forget the years spent gasping for air under the weight of their narratives, that I sacrifice my truth on the altar of their comfort. I ignored them too. Meanwhile, my immediate family grew quieter. The frantic public flailing gave way to sullen, resentful silence. It was the silence of people who knew they had lost but could not bear to acknowledge it. The silence of cowards licking their wounds in the dark. I imagined them gathered around the kitchen table where so many battles had been waged in the name of love, their faces tight with resentment, their words hushed and bitter. I imagined them parsing every post, dissecting every recording, searching for some thread to pull, some flaw to exploit. But there were none. I had been meticulous. I had been careful. I had given them no quarter. Yet even as I fortified my walls, I knew the siege was not truly over. People like them did not surrender. They regrouped. They evolved. And sure enough, soon a new tactic emerged from the ashes of their humiliation. They became pitiful. My sister, who had once laughed behind my back as our parents dissected my every flaw, suddenly posted tearful tributes online about the importance of family, about how misunderstandings could drive wedges between people who loved each other. She never mentioned me by name, of course. She was too clever for that, but the implication was clear. She cast herself as a wounded bystander caught in the crossfire, a loving sister aching for reconciliation. Strangers, unaware or unwilling to seek the full context, flooded her comments with sympathy and support. I watched it unfold with a detached, clinical fascination. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, reframed the story not as abusers being held accountable but as a tragic family rift caused by stubbornness and pride. Paint me as unforgiving. Paint themselves as heartbroken. It was a gambit designed to recast them as victims, to force the public sympathy pendulum back in their direction. It might have worked if not for the receipts. Quietly, without fanfare, I released a second wave of evidence. Messages from my sister mocking me for struggling with depression. Recordings of her siding gleefully with our parents as they tore me apart over things so trivial it was almost comical. I posted them without commentary, letting the words speak for themselves. The shift was almost immediate. Sympathy turned to confusion, then to horror. Her carefully crafted image cracked, the truth oozing out through the fissures for all to see. Her posts dried up. Her comments turned sour. The tide she had tried so desperately to turn swept her under instead. Still, I felt no joy. Perhaps once, long ago, vengeance might have tasted sweet. But now, it was ash on my tongue. What satisfaction could I take from proving what I had always known? They had never loved me, not as I was, only as the version of me they could manipulate and control. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt myself slowly, painstakingly. Not the glossy reconstruction they would have preferred, where I returned chastened and compliant, slotting neatly back into the roles they had scripted for me. No, this rebuilding was for me, and me alone. I found a new apartment far from the haunts of my childhood. I decorated it with colors they would have mocked, filled it with music they would have sneered at, stocked the kitchen with foods they would have called pretentious or ridiculous. Every small choice was an act of reclamation, a defiant assertion of selfhood. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the window, the city sprawling endlessly below, and feel the ghost of the old life whisper at the edges of my mind. The what-ifs, the should-haves, the grief for the family I never truly had, for the love I had yearned for and would never receive. But I let those whispers pass through me like wind through a broken screen door. They had no home here anymore. They still tried to contact me, of course. Even after everything, they could not accept that they had lost access to me. The messages changed in tone, pleading, angry, desperate, resigned. But the one constant was their complete inability to acknowledge the harm they had done. They spoke of misunderstandings, of miscommunications, of moving forward. Never of gaslighting, never of cruelty, never of accountability. I left their messages unread. Their access to me was a privilege they had squandered long ago, and now the bridge was not merely burned, it was obliterated, reduced to nothing but smoldering wreckage against a blackened sky. Some nights, when the world was quiet and the weight of history pressed heavier against my shoulders, I wondered if they truly believed their own lies. Had they rewritten their memories so thoroughly that they could look in the mirror and see only innocence reflected back? Or was it simply easier to blame me than to face the rotting core of what they had built? It no longer mattered. The truth was out. The illusion was shattered, and I was free, not just physically but spiritually, emotionally, existentially free from the invisible chains they had wrapped around me from birth. I was not their daughter anymore. I was not their scapegoat. I was not their pawn. I was my own. And as the city breathed and pulsed around me, alive and infinite, I knew that whatever came next, it would be on my terms, not theirs. It began not with a confrontation, not with an explosion of anger or one last, desperate attempt to drag me back into their orbit, but with a letter. A thin white envelope slipped under my door one morning, plain and unassuming, almost laughably out of place against the cold gray tiles of my new life. I stared at it for a long time, feeling its presence like a splinter embedded beneath the skin, small but impossible to ignore. There was no name on the front, only my address written in a trembling, unfamiliar scrawl that could have belonged to a stranger if not for the familiar, suffocating dread that wrapped itself around my throat the moment I saw it. I did not open it immediately. I left it lying on the kitchen counter while I made coffee, while I read the news, while the city outside roared and groaned and lived its noisy, indifferent life. Hours passed, and still it sat there, a malignant weight that seemed to pull the very light from the room. It was only when night fell, when the sky beyond my windows bled into a deep, bruised purple, that I finally picked it up, slid a knife carefully under the flap, and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was shaky, the words crammed together as if written in haste or desperation. It was from my mother, of course. Who else would dare breach the silence I had carved so meticulously around myself? The letter was a masterclass in manipulation, a final desperate attempt to rewrite history with the stroke of a pen. She spoke of love, of regret, of the pain of losing a daughter she claimed to have adored beyond measure. She apologized, but not for the things that mattered. She apologized for misunderstandings, for the way things had been perceived, for the pain she implied I had inflicted upon myself by being too sensitive, too stubborn, too unwilling to let go of old wounds. There was no acknowledgement of the gaslighting, the cruelty, the endless chipping away at my spirit that had led me to sever ties. There was only a plea for reconciliation, cloaked in the language of unconditional love but reeking of the same conditional acceptance that had poisoned my childhood. She ended the letter with a simple sentence that struck me harder than any accusation could have. "We are still your family whether you like it or not." I sat at the kitchen table long after the words blurred into meaningless shapes. My fingers curled tight around the edges of the letter until the paper crumpled beneath the pressure. They would never change. That was the truth I had fought so long to deny, to resist, to bargain with in the quiet, desperate moments when hope felt like the only thing keeping me upright. But hope was a liar, a seductress whispering pretty lies to keep me tethered to a sinking ship. There would be no apology worth accepting, no reconciliation that did not require me to erase myself all over again. And I was done erasing myself. The next morning I drafted my own letter. I did not waste words. I did not indulge in long, winding explanations or emotional appeals. I owed them nothing. Not anymore. I told them, plainly and without flourish, that I had heard their words, that I understood exactly what they were asking of me, and that my answer was no, there would be no reconciliation, no second chance, no return to the roles they had written for me. I was not their daughter anymore. I was not theirs at all. I signed it with my name, only my name, stripped of all the titles and ties they had once used to bind me, and mailed it the same day. I did not expect a response, and none came. In the weeks that followed, the noise around me quieted. The messages slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether. The friends who had been true remained. The ones who were only ever loyal to the illusion of my family drifted away, their absence a cleansing rather than a loss. The city, vast and unbothered by my private wars, embraced me in its endless cacophony, and I let it. I rebuilt, not from the shattered pieces of the past, but from new, sturdier materials forged in the fires of my own resilience. I found a new job, one that valued my voice rather than seeking to silence it. I made friends who saw me not as a project to fix or a trophy to display, but as a person, flawed and beautiful and real. I traveled, standing on the edges of cliffs and ancient ruins, letting the winds and the tides and the weight of history remind me how small my past was in the grand, teeming expanse of the world. And slowly, so slowly I hardly noticed it at first, the wounds they had left began to heal. Not into perfect, unblemished skin, no. The scars remained, ridged and rough beneath the surface, but they no longer ached with every movement. They were simply part of me now, silent testaments to battles survived, to storms weathered, to the unbreakable fact of my existence beyond them. I no longer checked my phone for their messages. I no longer scanned crowds for familiar faces, half dreading, half yearning for a confrontation that would never come. I no longer crafted arguments in my head, no longer rehearsed the speeches I would deliver if given the chance. I had said everything that needed to be said. I had told the truth, laid it bare for all the world to see. And then I had walked away. They had lost the right to an audience long ago. One evening, almost a year to the day after I had first posted the truth, I found myself standing on the roof of my apartment building, staring out over the city as the sun sank in a blaze of molten gold. I thought about the girl I had been, the girl who had begged for scraps of love, who had twisted herself into knots trying to be good enough, quiet enough, lovable enough. I thought about the nights spent crying into a pillow, the days spent second-guessing every word, every action, every breath. I mourned her. I honored her. And then, finally, I let her go. She had done the best she could. She had fought with everything she had to survive in a world that wanted to erase her. But she was not who I was anymore. I was no longer the child reaching out with empty hands, hoping for something that would never come. I was no longer the scapegoat, the punching bag, the invisible girl screaming into the void. I was here. I was whole. I was free. And that, I realized as the first stars winked into existence overhead, was all the closure I would ever need. I turned away from the city, from the past, from the ghosts that no longer haunted me. I descended the stairs to my apartment, my sanctuary, my chosen home. I closed the door behind me and locked it, not out of fear, but out of certainty. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some stories are meant to end.